And I'm going to talk a little bit about extension focused research. So as we are thinking about the number that Kandel already was mentioning about the soybean yield, I'm presenting here the soybean yield on the left in bushels per acre. And then we look at the bottom of the years that soybean has been growing in North Dakota. These are average yields. And as you can look here at the formula, you can see that the formula indicates that we have had an 0.3 bushel per acre increase. Now that increase over time, of course, is due to the increase in management, but also the increase in the genetics. So there's a combination. So today we're going to focus on both. We're going to talk a little bit about variety selection, and then we're going to talk a lot today about management. One of the points that on this slide shows you that we are below the trend line in this past year. Of course, we all know it was a droughty year and that caused the yields to be lower, but still surprisingly, we see that a lot of the soybeans still produce decent yields. So how do we find some of the variety information? And the NDSU every year is providing information, and we can find the trial results for soybeans. The easiest way to do that is to Google NDSU variety trials. And if we do that, we get to this particular place, and then you see on the right the trial results publication. If you click that one, you get the booklet in PDF format. This booklet is also available at several of the county offices, as well as the RECs, the research centers. This year we have actually developed a new tool that is brand new, which is available on vt.ag.ndsu.edu. You may want to check this one out. What it does, it is using the variety information from a site, and you can then kind of manipulate the data. So on the left, we have variety trials for all the diseases. I clicked here on soybean, and as you can see, there is here in the middle a kind of a separation by location. So if you look at this one, you can click this, you get then the information for that particular site. The interesting thing about this new tool is that you can click on any of the headings, and if you are clicking on the headings, you can then select it from high to low. So if you want to look at the highest yielding one, or you want to go by company, you can do that. Within the tool, there is also a way to chart information. And if we are charting information, you can, on the left, select what you want. For instance, here I have seed oil in percent as well as bushels. So then it gives for each variety the two things together in bars. So this is a nice tool to kind of play a little bit with the numbers and to dig into some of the details of the variety trial results. So the next section, I want to talk a little bit about several management strategies that we can have. The first one I want to visit with you is work that I've been doing for many years on water management. So this is a map of the near Fargo area. The red box is the Fargo airport, so it gives you kind of a reference point. The location is just close to the highway. I've been doing their research since about 2008. So I'm going to kind of summarize a few things. So what we have done is we have developed a site with tile and also with control boxes so that we can mimic tile and non-tile conditions. So the control box is here indicated in the red box on the slide. So in the left top, you see a unit where this area of the field is drained, where the tile box is open, so all the water drains. In the far end, you see water standing. That is because that section of the field is similar to the bottom right, is where we did not have the tile drainage open, so that it is just a natural condition. So this is a very large area. In each of the blocks, I do several experiments a year. So, as you can see, there are some control boxes, and every year we measure the water table within those boxes to see what happens actually with the water table as it is related to the production. So I'm just going to show you one slide. This is from the past year. The top is the surface of the soil. On the left, you can see that it goes down deep into the soil in feet. The blue is where the tile line is located. And then the two graph bars here, the blue and the red, are the water table for the tile. So as you can see, both of them were below the tile pipe, which means the tile did not run at all in 2021. But you can also see that the water table actually, as the season went on, the soybean was pulling that water. The water table still dropped quite a bit. We finally got some rain in September, October, and if you look at a fair amount of rain, but the water table did not budge much. And that is because the crop is also still utilizing some of the moisture. So the graph I'm showing here is just to show that there was no influence of water removal in the past year. However, if we looked at the yields, and I'm comparing now, the blue bar is no tile versus the red bar, which is tile. So I had several experiments going on. I had 5 different trials, and you can see the red bar in each of the trials was slightly higher. On average, the last 2 bars, we can see that there is a significant increase in tile versus no tile, while the tile was not running. So the explanation that I have is that over the years that I have had tile, a minute amount of the salts have been released through the pipe system, and we have a little bit better soil conditions. So this is kind of good news that even when there is no water movement from the field in certain conditions, you will still have a yield increase. So in this particular year, 2021, there was an 11% yield increase. So there is one factor that I would like to kind of talk about, is that once you are able to tile, you also can move your planting date. So what we did is we tried to go in as early as we could, and we planted the tile and the non-tile. And as you can imagine, the non-tile was a little bit more sticky and didn't work as well. But first of all, when we compare 2019 and 2020, the early planted tile versus the late planted tile, we can see that the yield level, if you delay your planting, is lower. So I'm going to focus especially where tile shines, and that is by earlier planting. So if you go back to 2019 and we compare the no tile and the tile, that difference was actually 13 bushels, and that was 28% increase in that particular situation. So tile shines if you also can plant early. As I mentioned, I have been working with this tile site for quite a number of years. So what I did just recently is to look at 31 trials starting in 2011 all the way to last year. And again, this graph is organized with each year. The blue bar is the yield in bushels per acre from soybeans with no tile. The red bar is the yield with tile. As you can see, the yields, of course, differ by year, and sometimes the tile is out yielding the no tile quite a bit. What is the important part for me is the end is where we can see that there is an increase. So over all those years, including dry years, and we had a number of dry years, we had a 7 or a 6% yield increase during that period. Now, I have to mention too that in all these trials, the majority of trials were planted when the no tile was ready. I showed you in the previous slide, if we are able to plant earlier due to the tile, the difference between those two numbers will be a lot larger. So this is a very conservative number. Well, you may say, well, I can't afford to invest in tile. So if you are not investing in tile, what would be the next option? Well, maybe we could think about seed bed and raising the root zone out of the flat ground, having the roots in that zone where there is air and not in the saturated zone, might be helping. So we did an experiment and we reported recently on this one. So I'm just going to give you the highlights, and the highlights are flat land, so no ridges, and raised beds where we just made the ridges. And if you can look here, you can see that the yield is indicated, soybean yield at the end. So the yield increased, as you can see, with the ridges. But I also want to draw your attention to the stand. In flat ground, where there is more stress, the stand was lower due to the water stress compared to the raised bed. So basically what we're doing is we're giving the plant the opportunity to establish and to yield well. So the next section, I'm going to talk briefly about some of the work I've been doing in a national soybean survey, and then follow up with some of the research that was based on some of the findings. So here you can see a map. It was a large study, not only in North Dakota, but throughout many of the soybean states. I was cooperating with my colleagues. But I'm going to focus only today on kind of the data from North Dakota and a few Northwest Minnesota points. So the idea was that we see that there is a production difference between what we can obtain in some of our variety trials. So I'm just picking here the variety trials at NDSU were 41 bushels per acre in 2021. And as you heard, the statistical service is predicting 25.5 to 26 bushels per acre of yield at the farm level. So as you can see, there is a yield gap between those two. So we pamper the plots and you see a yield increase. So what we're going to talk about today is hopefully giving you some of ideas to narrow that yield gap to get higher yields at the farm level. So if you look at some of the things that affect the yields, that is of course nutrition, weeds, and crop management, and those are the topics we're going to talk about. So just to kind of bring it home also a bit about genetic potential, when we talk about genetic potential, we are not even showing in our trial plots the genetic potential. So I showed you the 47 bushels that was in the variety trials, but I'm picking now a variety trial where we have irrigation. So now we eliminate water as a limiting factor. So this is data from 2007 to last year of the average yields in the variety trial at oaks irrigated, this soybean yield. So you can see there is here a trend line which shows that over the years there is an 0.8 bushel increase. So this one is high yield, as you can say, it is 70 plus bushel. So that is showing that the genetics is there for our crops to do really well. So we are not really talking about that the genetics is holding us back. But if we look at the highest yielding cultivars in oaks, you can see that some of those actually would have increased about 1 bushel per year over time. So the genetics is really good. So it is a factor, but it is not the main factor that is driving our reduced yields. The main factors that is holding us back is the management. So what we found in the big trial is, the planting date. So what I'm showing here is just looking at the month of May, from the 1st of May to the 31st of May, and there were more than 1,000 observations here. And here is the number of fields planted per day, and you can see that there is this middle of May where most of the fields were planted. So on average day in this example, we had a planting date of May of the 18th. Now, if we are looking at planting date and yield, so here we start with May 1st on the left to May 31st, and I put down all the yields of all those 1,000 plus fields when they were obtained after harvest with the planting date. And you see there is a slope here that indicates that as you plant later, your yields are also going down. So what we found is that there is about an 0.35 bushel per day difference if you plant 1 day later between May through about 1st of June. So just waiting a day planting gives you a yield reduction of about a third of a bushel, at least yield potential. Now, the second factor, of course, is the maturity of the varieties. So what I did is here, I took the varieties that were growing in Ransom and Sargent counties. The maturity rating is on the bottom and the yield is on the left represented. And again, we see that there is a relationship. So this was a trial that I did last year, but we also asked the same with the growers. What maturity do you have and what yield did you get? So here the maturity groups from a double 0.05 all the way to 1.4 and the bushels per acre. And again, you see this nice trend line. So in other words, if you look at the formula, you can come to the conclusion that if you can increase your maturity by 1/10 of a point, you can probably gain 0.7 bushel per acre. So if you go from an 0.6 to an 0.7, you can gain. Now, I'm always saying that this is, within where you are, within range. If you are jumping too many maturity groups ahead, then of course we'll get into trouble at the end of the season. So within reason, we should try to maximize our selection of maturity. So this is a map of what actually farmers reported during that study, where the maturity groups are grown. So of course in the north we have the double O's, and then if we go to the south we have this group 1.1 to 1.4. As you can see, some of them are curved, and that has to do that in the western part of the state we typically are drier, so you have to have a variety that matures earlier. So farmers have been selecting an early maturing variety. Within some of the trials that we have been doing and farmer visits, we have also looked at a little tool called the canopy cover. And we used an app called Canopio. The gentleman here has a phone. He takes a picture, and with the picture, you can then estimate the cover. And why that is important, I will show you in a couple of graphs here. So here on the top, the two photographs is the actually photo taken from the field. And I'm looking here at 24-inch row spacing with 80,000 live seeds planted and 200,000 live seeds. And the number here, this one is covered by 52% of the soil is covered with green tissue that intercepts the sunlight. With higher seeding rate, it is higher number 59. So the picture here is how they calculate it. So the app turns every green pixel into white and everything else into black, and then gives it the ratio. This is a very nice little tool. So what I want to show you here is, if you go to the 12-inch, now you compare seeding rate, and you can see that with seeding rate differences, with the higher seeding rates, we get a higher coverage, that's 83%. So in our studies, we compared yield from 24 and 12-inch, and there was a very strong correlation between the numbers that we found early in the season of canopy cover. So here you can see 52%, 63, the only difference, same seeding rate, 80,000. That was the seeding distance, the row spacing. So if we look at 24 with high seeding rate, we go from 59 to 83. So in other words, when we can intercept more sunlight, we get high yield. I don't have enough time to show you all the data here, but based on this, we decided to put a study together where we have an interaction between variety planting date, early planting and late. Row spacing was fixed because we know that row spacing 12 inches was out yielding. And then I have two populations, that's the seeding rate. Seeding rate is not the same as the plant stand. We'll come to that in a minute. And then I have two maturities, an 0.5 and an 0.8. So Castleton from last year, the trial you can see here between the red bars is the early planted, and to the right was the late planted. So I'm only going to give you the highlights. So in 21 environments, so I've done it in 3 years, 21 environments, and I'm looking here at early planting and late planting. So early is as soon as we could get in, and 2 weeks later. On the left, you see the yield. So we early planting, late planting, but I'm kind of focusing on the last two bars, the average between those 3 years, the A and B reflecting that the yields are significantly different. And earlier planting resulted in a 6.5% higher yield. What happens when you early plant is too that the conditions are slightly more challenging. And if we have slightly more challenging conditions, then we also will see that we have oftentimes a lower plant stand. So this is early planting. The stand that was obtained in all the trials was lower than late planting when the soil conditions are higher. However, as you could see, even with the lower stand, we could still see a higher yield. One of the things that we know that happens if you are looking at the filling of the grain, that early planting will also have the grain filling in the optimum period of the year, and we saw an increase in the oil content, a significant increase, although it is only 0.2% difference. Now, the danger, of course, is if you are looking at maturity selection or you're looking at planting date, that we can have an early frost. And remember just 2020 when we had an early September frost. So now I'm looking at early maturing and late maturing. So early maturing is the 0.5 versus an 0.8. And here we're looking at the 3-year average, the last 2 bars. You can see that there is the 3 environments for this past year, we see an increase. Now, I want to draw your attention to the droughty conditions in Castleton. So the early variety out-yielded at Castleton the late maturing variety, and it simply was a factor that the crop ran out of moisture at the end. So there is a factor of frost, but there is also a factor of drought. But if we look at all the environments, and I'm looking at the last bars, we can see that there is definitely an increase in yield if we plant a later maturing variety. And in all those data points, we get a 6% increase higher yield. So the higher population, we know that higher population sometimes gives you a higher yield, but that was not quite the case in this experiment. We saw a marginal higher yield, just only 1% higher, and probably the cost of extra seed would not justify this. However, what I was interested in is to see if there is an interaction. So here I put everything together from the 21 environments. So it is a little bit of a busy slide. So I'm going to break it down to you. The bushels per acre are indicated again to the left. So first of all, I want to show you that the 4 bars on the left part of the graph are the late maturing. So as a group, the late maturing out-yielded the early maturing, as we already seen. The second one, consistently, I've marked the green being the early planted versus the late. Now, although no significantly difference between some of the numbers, the trend you can see is that early planting has been higher than late planting, which we also show in the main effect. Now, looking at the seeding rate, although you did not see, if we average them across early and late planting, if we just look at early planting, the early planting with higher seeding rate was slightly higher yielding than the lower seeding rate. So if I just put those conclusions together for this particular study, then plant as early as possible will give you a longer growing season. Plant with an adapted full maturity cultivar. When planting earlier is even more important to do that, then you get the biggest benefit. And maybe use a higher seeding rate. And I'm saying the higher seeding rate because we already concluded that early planting actually gives you a little bit less stand than late planting. So adjusting the seeding rate, especially under the challenging conditions, may help to get a higher yield. So I want to finish up today with a couple of observations. Greg will talk more about cover crops, but I'm talking here about cover crops seeded into the sun and to the soybean. We've done quite a bit of work, and I'm just going to summarize what we found. So basically, we seeded in the fall into standing soybeans, and what we did, we had different row spacings, we had different seeding rates of the rye, we had different maturities of the soybeans, thinking that early maturing would out-yield in the biomass. So basically, you can see a picture here on the left, seeded into soybeans. On the right, you see the cover in the spring. So the last slide here, what did we find? Cover crops broadcasted into soybeans. You use a regular maturing soybeans. If you use an early maturing soybeans, you're going to use some or reduce your yield. If you are narrow row spacing, better to interseed rye into the narrow row spacing because you're out yielding with the narrow row spacing versus the wide, and you don't have the benefit of extra rye growth. Broadcast between the R6 and the R8, the rye can establish very late into the season, and we can terminate the rye before seeding for an early season crop like wheat.